Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners, from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. Today's episode is Chapter 2 of a unique three-part conversation that I began last month, focusing on a fascinating book, What Went Right? Lessons from Both Sides of the Teacher's Desk, by co-authors Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott. Roberta, a longtime friend, was one of my classmates at Syosset High School on Long Island in the late 1960s. George was our 11th grade American Lit teacher. Roberta, a lifelong writer and author, is currently the director of the nonprofit Squire Family Foundation, dedicated to encouraging the teaching of philosophy at pre-college levels. And George, now a writer and poet, has had several teaching jobs, as well as extensive editorial experience in businesses and media fields over the course of his career. In my first conversation with George on June 13th, we talked about how he and Roberta reconnected after more than 50 years on social media and began a steady correspondence that evolved into a provocative exchange about their perspectives over several decades, from inside and outside the classroom, which ultimately turned into their book, What Went Right, essentially a story of their own lifelong learning experiences. Everything from what they've learned about the roles of teachers as instructors and mentors, to the continuous debates over curriculum and standardized testing, to the fundamental questions about how education should prepare young people to be human, that is, discerning and productive citizens in a complex, often unpredictable world. George and I talked about his early experiences at Syosset with Roberta, and I shared some of my own recollections of that time, looking back at how things were, not so much with nostalgia, but rather reflecting on what they meant, given changing perspectives and experiences over the course of our lifetime. Today, we're going to continue that conversation with both Roberta and George, focusing more on what's changed in public education, society, and our own lives since Syosset. As I mentioned earlier, it's a decidedly different spin on the concept of lifelong learning, which, as we get older, is one of the most important ingredients to healthy aging. It's a story about teaching and learning, but also what we've learned about ourselves. So now I'm delighted to welcome Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott. Roberta and George, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you. As I mentioned in the intro, we're going to talk mainly about what's changed since your Syosset days. But first, I wanted to catch up a little bit with you, Roberta, and bring you into the show. And I'm going to, even though George and I talked about how you guys reconnected, I'm going to use my prerogative as author of the podcast, and I'm going to switch back to a different narrator, because often you have different views of things. So tell me a little bit about your recollection about how you and George reconnected.
Yeah, it's funny because it came because of social media, which I have decidedly mixed feelings about. I was somewhat active on Facebook in whatever year it was. George, I don't remember when we first started corresponding, but I saw that George was posting various articles or posting links to various articles about the state of education these days, and his views very much corresponded to mine. And I believe I reached out through social media, starting by saying, I'm not sure if you remember me, even though I had a hunch that you did, because it was, we're also narcissistic. It seemed like such a fantastic class. How could he not remember all of us?
Right.
And so we started emailing, which was a much more copacetic way of being in touch for me anyway, and I think for George too. And we were just going back and forth about our experiences since we had lost touch in 1969 when Ron and I graduated. And again, our thoughts were very much in keeping. I was very taken with the fact that, George, you had this experience of teaching in the 60s. During that period, then you took a break from teaching and then you returned. I thought that gave you and you said yourself that it gave you a unique perspective on how things had changed, even though the settings were very different, suburban and inner city. So as we got deeper and deeper into our conversation, it just occurred to me one day that maybe these were worth compiling and writing about in a more serious way. Then the interesting thing was that we casted about trying to figure out how to write this book. Should we write it in a single voice? Should we have alternating chapters? Until we finally came upon the fact that since the book began as a series of letters, we should preserve that, which was kind of very satisfying
Mm-hmm.
and also surprising in its own way, which is a testament to the power of the written word
Mm-hmm.
and to literature, which is where the three of us met and began and remained faithful to. So that was a very satisfying evolution.
Right, right. Yeah, and for me, when I discovered that you guys had reconnected, now I feel, well, I feel privileged, Roberta, that we've been friends for such a long time, and everyone goes through different cycles in life and raising family and moving around and so forth. So we were able to keep in touch occasionally and but continually. And I really appreciate that. Look forward to every time we had a coffee somewhere or, shared a Mexican lunch somewhere.
Yeah, very nice.
And it was also just um, a real joy to find that you had reconnected with George, because as I mentioned to George in our previous conversation, it's, how often do you get a chance to really, reflect with a teacher who had a profound experience on profound influence on you, as because most of us, graduate and like, bye, we go off to college and maybe we'll see you at a reunion if teachers show up, but you don't get a chance to find out what happened to teachers and even think about, like, oh, you think about teachers, they just stay, right? Like parents, you just stay, but that's not true. Your experiences evolve over time too. So let me pick up on what you said, Roberta, and switch to you, George. So talk a little bit about your Philadelphia experience, your Philadelphia story, because it is sort of unusual that a teacher, once you move on to another career, goes back. So talk about that a little bit, about why you did it and what you discovered.
Well, one of the reasons that one of the common reasons that teachers leave teaching is that they can't afford to continue teaching.
Right.
That was one of the main reasons I left. Long Island is an expensive place to live, and teachers don't make the kind of salary that you need. At least they didn't then.
Right.
And I don't think they do now either, to live on Long Island. And but when in the intervening decades between the time I left Syosset and the time I began in Philadelphia, I had moved to Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
I had a daughter with the wife that I was married to in Syosset. We got divorced. I remarried, and at one point, maybe after 30 years after I had been a teacher, my second wife said, she was working, she's a professional, she had an income. She said, you could afford to go back to teaching.
Mm.
I said, huh, you're right, I could. And so I did. And I started in a charter school. One of the things that I was not certified. Well, I wasn't certified in New York any longer because it had been so long. And I certainly was not certified in Pennsylvania because I had never even thought about being certified. But charter schools, not all charter schools require the teachers be certified. And that makes it easier for them to hire people. It makes it easy for them to hire people who are not necessarily conventional teachers. It also makes it easier for them to pay them less, and makes it easier for them to fire them when they start getting expensive and replace them with new graduates who don't have, that sort of thing. There's a lot. I'm not pro charter school as a rule. I think there is a place for charter schools, for some charter schools, and we can get into that sometime if you want to.
Okay.
But I started in a charter school. I was teaching seventh and eighth grade
Hmm.
English in this charter school, which was a trip and a half.
Hmm.
And I decided I wanted to go back to high school teaching, and I did eventually find that we go through the process that Pennsylvania mandated for getting certified. I did get certified, and once I was certified, the school district of Philadelphia hired me to teach in Title I high school,
Hmm.
and it was not Syosset. It was very, very different,
Right.
but it was still rewarding. There are
Mhm.
it's different rewards,
Mhm.
but still rewarding.
Right.
And
Right.
and yeah, it was the teachers getting to the point that you raised, I guess, the changes in teaching,
Hmm.
in education, in public education. The the teachers who had been there all along didn't really see it
Hmm.
because it had been an evolution.
Right.
I did see it, as Roberta mentioned. It was a unique perspective. I was gone, and what I remembered about teaching was Syosset. When I
Hmm.
came back to it, it was Philadelphia in the early 21st century,
Right.
and it was a whole different world. And it was not all a result of urban versus suburb.
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah. Well, what were some of the differences? And you can jump in too, Roberta, because you've dealt with students, closer to our contemporary times too, in terms of what changes there have been in the classroom. I think that you, in our last conversation, George, you talked about it. It's harder today in many ways, and um, there are more constraints on teachers. And I think both of you have mentioned. I think in your book you had extensive conversations about the difficulties too with this, especially public education, this constant, um, uh, I would say, fixation on fixing it, right? You constantly have people coming in to try to fix it, whatever they think needs to be fixed. And so that to me, it has made it harder being a teacher today. Not to mention, people talk about teachers' pensions, but it is, um, you mentioned, George, and perhaps you want to comment too, Roberta, on just, one of the issues is how the public looks at teachers, the demands they have on them and the responsibilities with, you know, less and less authority in some respects. I don't know if you want to jump in, Roberta, or George, either one.
Well, I just want to say very quickly that I've been following a story in the news about the teaching of reading and how that has been swung. You talked about the need to fix. When I was doing my student teaching, I guess that was in the early 70s, when I was still in college, there was a big movement toward that. I think it's called the whole language movement, where you don't teach kids to read through phonics. You just have them write their own words however they sound, and you do it through a holistic approach. And now that has come under great criticism, and everyone's back to phonics. So it seems to me that teaching is, this is something we try to talk about in our book, that teaching is very vibrant and it's relational, and it's constantly changing. I think it's a mistake to think that I mean, I know there's the core skills that need to be taught, but in many ways the way it's taught is often more of a hybrid than ideological. And I think but I think that so many other factors are at play now. And I give you so much credit, George, for going back and getting certification. The thought of my entering a classroom of young kids today is just completely beyond. I mean, I can't even imagine it. I can't keep up with the technology. I can't keep up with the changing notions of basic concepts that I thought would not be changing, such as about privacy and gender and all the ways in which things have moved on. So I think we hang on to this notion of stability over time, and that's completely misleading.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and although I too feel attraction to stability, there's also the other side, the flip side of it, which is, I think one of the things that teachers are less able to do today than they were able to do at the end of the 60s is adapt their teaching to the needs of their classes, and even the individual students in those classes. They're much more regimented. They're much more constrained by the testing that's going to occur periodically through the students' lives, and much more constrained by the external pressures that are being brought to bear on the schools. I remember parent-teacher organization meetings in Syosset that got fairly contentious, but the parents were pretty much willing to admit that the teachers knew more about education than they did. That's no longer the case. And the teachers today are constantly being questioned on educational issues, and which is preposterous. I mean, if there's anyone who knows about education, it's the educators themselves, and it's not the politicians, and it's not the whoever people that are out there. It's the reformers, who are mostly politicians these days, are identifying themselves as educational experts, but they're not. And even the ones who are positively motivated, I think, are at best paternalistic, and at worst, they're actually destructive. They're disparaging. They're trying to get rid of tenure, which is the one thing that teaching ever had as a like an attraction for people. And they're even basing teacher evaluations on student test results, which is like basing a lawyer's evaluation or a doctor's evaluation on how many of his patients get sick. I mean, it's not. I can't think of a parallel. That's not a good analogy, but I can't think of a good one.
Well, hold on to that thought, George. We're going to take a short break, but it'll be a very short break. And when we come back, we'll be talking much more with co-authors Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott. We'll be right back, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to 45 Forward, where we're talking with George McDermott and Roberta Israeloff, the co-authors of What Went Right. Before we continue, I wanted to let you know you can find out more about their backgrounds by going to my website, rowellresources.com, and clicking on the 45 Forward tab. And today's conversation is part one of what will be a unique three-part summer series with another episode in August. You can find the previous episode by going to my site and just looking at our episode of June 13th. So anyway, before the break, George was talking a little bit about, some of the political nature of public education. And I just wanted to mention that during the break, I was talking with George and Bert about recollecting one event that I experienced in high school. And when I was the editor of the school paper and was asked to facilitate a meeting at that time, we had a PTA that became the PTSA with the students. And I forget the exact issues, but the meeting quickly got contentious and really out of control, and I and people were yelling and sounds like today, but I basically had to just grab the microphone and take over and tell people to sit down, and then of course in those days, I got then criticized. Oh, so you're taking over, you're dictating the meeting. I'm like, yeah, that's what I need to do. So I had a quick appreciation of how difficult teaching. I wasn't teaching, but it can be to really deal with the public in public education when you really have all these different constituencies. And George, you were talking about the break too about a different better spin on it, I thought, which is you were quoting Hannah Arendt. Tell me that quote again, so we can.
Yeah. Hannah Arendt said that life is about using the whole box of crayons, and I think the way that relates to teaching, to education, is that to a great degree, the people who are trying to control the curriculum in a school, who are trying to control which books are allowed to be taught, which books are not allowed to be taught, which books are not even allowed to be on the premises of the school, even in the library, um, are trying to make sure that everybody's using only a certain number of colors
Right.
out of that box of crayons. And
Right.
that's teachers are that hobbles the teachers today.
Right. Yeah, Roberta, I wanted to switch back to you a moment and talk about some of your, later experiences teaching in different kind of ways, and actually introducing crayons that I never had a chance in high school, which was the teaching of philosophy. And so I really enjoyed my philosophy classes in college, but we never really had that so much in high school. So tell us a little bit about your teaching philosophy and your ethics ball, which I thought was a really interesting experience.
Well, yeah, we didn't have philosophy per se in high school, but I felt that every course that I cared about was deeply influenced or suffused with philosophical
Hmm.
thought, and that they were these open-ended questions where you could hone your arguments and your points, but there was no definitive.
Hmm.
So we were left questioning. I hated the philosophy course I took in college, and my recollection was that I did terribly in it. I was
Huh.
quite surprised when I found my transcript when I went through my papers years later and discovered I got a B, which of course was like an F in those days. But I didn't know what the philosophy readings were talking about. I needed to get to philosophy, and still do, through literature. Um, and I don't actually teach philosophy. It's kind of remarkable how little the content I need to know to direct this foundation, which was created by another classmate of ours. Your listeners must think that we're kind of an incestuous group here, that we all are in touch with each other and keeping track of each other. But Gary Squire was a classmate as well, who did
Hmm.
not have philosophy in high school, but he did study it and fall in love with it and got a master's in it over in Oxford, and then decided, as George, you mentioned, that this would not provide him with the living that he would like, and went to law school and became a real estate business person. But when he decided to become systematic about his philanthropy, he realized that he wanted to acknowledge the debt he owed to his philosophy professors. And at one point, we actually went back to New Haven,
Hmm.
to Yale, to meet with the philosophy professor who was most influential to him. And I don't remember, I think it was Professor Morowitz, actually. He was so touched by the experience, so moved by it.
Hmm.
It reminds me of the fact that we talked before about how often teachers don't hear from students after a while. I actually kept in touch with several teachers. As a matter of fact, I'm still in touch with a teacher, not so much, but still am, from seventh grade, because
Oh.
I just revered my teachers. I just wanted to know what they knew.
Hmm.
And so this professor was thrilled to learn about the foundation, and Gary felt strongly that why aren't more young students introduced to philosophy? So I hooked up with some actual philosophers and
Hmm.
educators who are interested in this, and we're trying um, to get philosophy introduced, which is proving to be quite a Herculean task, because
Hmm.
there are all kinds of obstacles, some of
Right.
which we touched on in terms of the time, the curriculum. Philosophy is famously subversive. People get killed for it,
Hmm.
and I think that's part of the threat. But I'm kind of reassociating here, but this is such a provocative conversation. Ronnie, when you said that you were facilitating that meeting and people got so incensed, no one followed you to your car, I assume, and said, we know who you are and where we live, and we're going to come after you,
Right.
which is what's happening these days.
Right.
It's pretty terrifying now in a way that I don't think it was. I don't mean to glorify the past. And I also heard this morning driving to the gym on NPR that several states are passing laws prohibiting libraries from even acquiring certain books, that
Mhm.
the book acquisitions have to be approved by the local politicians,
Right.
which is completely a terrifying proposition.
Right.
So philosophy and this kind of open inquiry, we talk about inquiry so much my colleagues, encouraging children to explore their own thoughts and to hear that other people share them, that they're not alone. There's a way in which the humanities provide such a haven for kids who feel that their questions are not entertained, they're not taken seriously. Um, for me, philosophy and English classes, literature were kind of synonymous. I know
Yeah.
they're not for everyone, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, I talked a bit too about, so you took it though to another level with the ethics bowl, which I think was an interesting way to really it's not classroom learning, but it's basically turning it into a different kind of, I don't want to say practical experience, but really a communal experience, a challenging experience.
yes,
And
the Ethics Bowl is one of the best events ever. It's a form of debate that we think is much superior to debate because students are given cases with ethical dilemmas. Some are timeless and some are timely, and they're asked to come up with a position about what one should do. It's not just a theoretical intellectual exercise. It's what should happen in this situation when you have two competing systems of right. And they come together and they discuss them. They don't argue with each other. They each present their position. Their position is then commented on by the other students. The original team has a chance to respond to the comments, and then they're questioned by adult judges or older people, graduate students or whatever. And there's a winner and they get a trophy. But the main thing is that what we hear from students and from teachers and from judges and parents is that the kids are taken seriously. They enjoy talking about serious topics, and the students almost to a one say, we don't have this opportunity in school anymore. No one asks us what we think. No one wants to hear what we have to say. No one gives us time to have a serious conversation. It's all statement and on to the next. They also talk about how much rote memorization there is,
mhm.
how quickly things have to be moved through. And all I kept thinking about is I wish they could have been in our English class because that's what happened when
Right.
we had American Lit.
Right.
And they don't have that opportunity now. So the Ethics Bowl, which began as a college event and now is a high school event and also a middle school event, is a good introduction to philosophy, but it's also an introduction to inquiry. It's very supportive of furthering of democratic ideals because you get to see that no one person has all the answers. You get to
Hmm.
collaborate. It's a fabulous event, and there is a website, the National High School Ethics Bowl. It's
Hmm.
based in the University of North Carolina, and I
Wow.
hope that many people
Right.
will check it out.
Yeah. Thanks, Roberta. Yeah. Your description of this reminds me of a conversation and that you and George had in the book too in high school of a concept which I really liked, which is as opposed to transfusional learning of just being, getting an infusion of knowledge, which in some cases it's important, but your term for it was expeditionary learning, which I really liked. It's sort of like treating, the learning process as a journey, and literally, you and I were influenced by George. Uh, talk about that a little bit in terms of, what do you mean by that, George? And also, you guys can talk about too. One of my experiences with you was using basically The Great Gatsby as an expedition of our own.
Well, that obviously made sense for you because we were on Long Island,
Right.
and that's the setting for the book, and yeah, I think teachers, especially English teachers, are always trying to figure out a way to make what they're teaching relevant for their students, and it was, I thought, a lot easier to do for The Great Gatsby than it would have been for, say, The Scarlet Letter, because the you didn't know much at that point about adultery, but
Right.
but you knew about Long Island, and I happened to be living in the town that was East Egg in the in the novel, and and uh, and I knew which house Fitzgerald had used as the model for the Buchanan house, and I
Right.
was able to tell you that, and I was able to tell you roughly where the Valley of Ashes was if you were taking the Long Island Railroad or the subway into the city, but I didn't know where Gatsby's house was, and I told you I assumed there was a real house. I was confident there was a real house that he had used as a model for it, but I didn't know what it was. And I was pleased to find out when the senior year began, your senior year began, that you two in particular, had found it. and,
Right.
and that is, I think, probably a good definition of expeditionary learning, a literal expedition.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think even metaphorically, that's what I felt strongly about the way that you taught, and as Roberta started to say too about the exploration, of, and you challenge us with the questions, and I think you've said a number of times it's not about the answers, it's about the questions, and I think um, that's an important thing, and it's a hard thing because it requires a certain trust of students that that's what that they're going to continue searching for answers, and there's a risk too because then they're going to keep searching, and you're not going to shut them up with an answer. That's and I think that is somewhat of the problem. Sometimes we use answers to shut people up from asking questions. And I go ahead.
One of the things that one of the things that I just read recently was there's a woman in the a teacher, a Michigan teacher, strangely enough, even though that's where I think when I think of Michigan teachers, I tend to think of Betsy DeVos, but this woman was very much the opposite. Her name is Gail Martin.
Hmm.
I don't know her, but I read a comment she made. She was talking about the people who are attacking public education as being indoctrinating students,
Hmm.
especially leftist indoctrination. And I know we never did that,
Right.
but and she said the first step in indoctrination is not providing access to ideas, it's eliminating access to ideas. And that's absolutely true. I mean, what we were trying to do was provide access to as many ideas as possible,
Right.
as frequently as possible, and ideally conflicting ideas,
Hmm.
and let you figure out which one you wanted to embrace.
Right. Right. Yeah. We're going to come up with a break in a couple of minutes, but I just want to at least touch on one of the difficulties these days with expeditionary learning is that the environment has changed. One of the things that's changed a lot, of course, is the ascent of all sorts of digital media, right? I mean, and this is um, certainly it's a wonderful thing when I can't remember, someone's name or name of a book, and you can Google it and find out and not rack your brains for hours or try to ask your wife or your friends what's the name. But there is a problem with what it does to reading. And I just wanted to. So when we come back, we're going to take another short break. When we come back, I want to pick up this topic with both of you about what to do about the fact that people aren't reading books, or they're reading a very narrow range of them, as you put it, George, using only a couple of crayons. So when we come back, folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be back with our last segment with George and Roberta. Welcome back, folks, to 45 Forward. We're talking with George McDermott and Roberta Israeloff, the co-authors of What Went Right. A look at over a lifetime of the public education process and their roles and their experiences over time. So before the break, we were talking about, how do we teach people in a time of digital media? And Roberta was talking to me during the break a little bit. I wanted to lift up what she was saying, just about the impact on engagement. Really diving into things and how digital media has affected it. And it certainly is true that people are not deep readers. And I have to say, full disclosure, I find it hard too. It's in our course of our daily lives, it's hard. And I actually, few years ago, got involved with a men's book group of some friends well, mostly one of my friends. And I found that if I if I wasn't held to the discipline of having a book every month that I had to be with several other folks to discuss, it's hard to find that time to really be engaged in a book. So
Yeah, but time is definitely part of it, and social media makes things so much quicker, as you say, and more accessible. But what I was saying during the break was that I just happened to read a letter to the editor of a magazine and talking about the experience of looking at a painting, a famous painting, or any painting really, on as an image online, a digital image, versus seeing the painting yourself. And this person, I don't know who this is, just a reader of this magazine, wrote, "Looking at a painting in person is a true and full experience. It requires the observer and the observed to share a space so that both are implicated. It is an encounter with another point of view." And that to me is the essence of what the humanities is, that it's an encounter, it's an engagement. I think the arts are the truest way for me. I know other people get there through different paths, but for me, it's the only way I can really get out of my own skin and see into. It's like a window into someone else's soul. When you read a book in a serious way that's meaningful to you, you really get to get out of your own head and into someone else's thoughts and feelings and being. And so it's an encounter. It's not static. It's very dynamic. And being taught to engage with a text in this way in high school, in our English classes, it was engaging with the text in a deep way, but it was engaging with each other and hearing what the other students had to say, hearing what George had to say, which leads to the most helpful concept in philosophy I've come upon yet, which is this idea of intellectual humility, that nobody has all the answers, but that together we can come up with an answer that may be better than some others. And you get that when you kind of give yourself up to the artistic experience, whether it's looking at a play or reading a book or looking at a painting. And I think that's something that has just dropped out of education in our rush to quantify. I know, George, we talked a lot about quantifiable results as opposed to qualitative learning. And I think that's such a loss.
Yeah, pick up on that, George.
Well, there are. I was thinking as you were talking, Robert, I was thinking about the notion that a lot of people don't want that kind of engagement. They don't want their children to have that kind of engagement. They don't want their children to be able to identify with other people. They don't want their children to be able to walk in someone else's shoes. They don't want their children to be able to feel what it would be like in someone else's skin. And as a result of that, I had a thought the other day. I was thinking that there seems to be an embracing these days of ignorance as a solution for social conflict. If you don't know it, then the conflict isn't there. If you're not aware of it, then you're not conflicted by it. And if the teacher If a teacher is not allowed to teach something about something, then the parents and as a result, their children can pretend it never existed. If you want to deal with stuff like this history's fraught racial history, or they can pretend it doesn't exist, as with women and gender and that sort of stuff that's going and discrimination that's still going on, or they can pretend that it will not happen.
Mhm.
And because if you don't teach about it, it didn't, it doesn't, and it won't happen.
Mhm.
You know, that's the belief. And teachers, that's antithetical to education. Teachers, that's not how teachers want to work. Teachers want to work the way Roberta just said. They want to try to present things that will engage the students and cause the students to see things from points of view that they didn't see them before coming into the class.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? Isn't that the point?
Yeah, I think people, I'm sorry, Berta, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we three are definitely in agreement about that. But, you know, that's
Yeah.
why we stayed together. That's why we were able to either stay together or reconnect so quickly.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's, I think part of the problem, well, for me, as a journalist, seeing so much of the proliferation of information and data and opinions that it becomes overwhelming to the system, and people sort of opt out, and they go toward one of the things that you talk about a lot is the constant struggle with the balance of standardization versus the flexibility that you guys really need in order to deal with your students. And it comes up in two ways. As George mentioned, it comes up in curriculum, as well as the constant it is sort of a challenge, and you guys have admitted it, the two sides of what we call tracking, and in certain, in some ways it helps you work with students in a more specialized but perhaps technocratic way. But it also then segments people, and now there are difficulties in terms of political influences about against uh, sort of, I guess, tracking, for lack of a better word. But how do you advance students, but also lift students up that you didn't might perhaps expect to be at a certain level. And George, I know so you were at Syosset and you were at in the Philadelphia school, and I'm sure this came up a lot in terms of how do you really do the best for students.
Yeah, it's a constant, and that's a constant tension between. I mean, obviously, you would love it if you could take a totally egalitarian approach to teaching your students, and it would be great if we could take kids of all abilities and all backgrounds and all futures, all what their lives are likely to be in the future, and put them together in the same pot and let them influence each other, as well as the teacher influencing them. I think from my point of view, that's an ideal situation, but it's also a resource heavy situation. If I did in Philadelphia, I had classes that were there were students in the same class who were reading at they were nominally in, say, 11th grade, but some of them were reading at maybe 3rd grade level, and others were reading at the level that the Syosset students were reading at. And that's very difficult to manage when you are the only teacher in the room. Now, if I had had teaching assistants, if I had had support people, if I had had a staff, it would have been marvelous. It would have been great. We could have brought them together when it made sense to bring them together. We could have taken them apart, separated them when that made sense. We could have provided extra learning opportunities for the faster kids and remedial stuff for the slower kids. We could, and all kinds of experiential enrichment. But I never even saw a teaching assistant in the years that I was teaching in Phil. I assume they existed because they were part of the budgeting process, but I never saw one. I never had one. I didn't know how, for me, it was just a matter of figuring out a way to do either 3 different lesson plans for the single class, or even more frequently teaching to the middle and hoping that the faster kids wouldn't get bored and the slower kids wouldn't get lost.
Right. I see you nodding, Roberta.
Yeah, I just heard, I agree. I think that the, what do they call it? Differential learning is a joke, and it's disrespectful of teachers because it makes them make 3 lesson plans instead of 1, and no one, or teach to the middle and no one is served. But to your point, George, again, in the mornings I listen to NPR, and I just heard a story that said that having a teaching assistant in the room is not effective. You need 2 teachers. You need full 2 teachers. And that's another sign to me of how teachers are disrespected and undervalued, devalued in our society, that we can't, because of course, we should be together. Syosset was so striated, I didn't know most of the kids in the school. I just knew the kids who were in our classes. I didn't know the kids who weren't in our track at the time. It was like going to a private school in a public school, which is not optimal.
Right.
But on the other hand, so putting everybody into one classroom is what democracy is, but you don't just throw them in with one teacher and say, handle this. It's completely disrespectful of the profession of teachers.
Right.
I don't know whether it was in your class, your year or not, but there was one time when the English and history teachers at Syosset tried to coordinate the way we were teaching. We were we tried to be teaching about the same kinds of things, same kinds of issues at the same time. So you would get the social studies perspective and the humanist points of view at the same time.
Right.
And, I don't know how well it worked. I don't know. It was never really team teaching, but it was at least sort of coordinated.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're coming to the close of our conversation. I just want to end on a note that one thing you mentioned to me before, Roberta, or I think you actually talk about in the book too, just punctuating the fact that teaching being both a science and an art. It's you call it a hybrid profession, which makes it hard to wrap your arms around it. It's true, but it involves both of that and requires you to be, constantly thinking and changing. And as you mentioned before, you can't be static as a teacher. But at any rate, there's much more to talk about. I want to thank both of you, though, for a terrific conversation. I'm glad we have one more session because there's a lot more to talk about. So folks, watch out for that next month on August 16th. We'll have our 3rd of our trilogy with Roberta and George. Once again, folks, tell your friends that they miss our conversation today with George McDermott and Roberta Israeloff. You can listen to it as a podcast on voiceamerica.com. Just search for my show, Voice 45 Forward. You could also find an Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or go to my website, roelresources.com, and click on 45 Forward. So be very sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, when I'll be talking with Jackie Agdern of Friendship Force, an international cultural exchange and home hosting organization. So folks, until then, keep moving forward, 45 Forward.